Good morning. Just 2 days ago was Easter, the day that many Christians around the world consider the highest, holiest day in the Christian year. But we're not done with Easter now just because Easter Sunday has passed, because Easter Sunday starts a season called Eastertide. Eastertide lasts 50 days and ends on Pentecost Sunday about 7 weeks from now. So we're still in the season of Easter. Now, your church tradition may not talk a lot about tides, but there are actually several of them. Eastertide, Kingdom Tide, Christmas Tide, High Tide, Low Tide, Riptide. Actually quite an array. Now, your life will still be complete if you can't name all the tides. But your life will be sorely lacking if you've never given serious thought to the meaning of Easter and the resurrection. I've been wrestling with the resurrection for many years. I started wrestling with the resurrection as a teenager, a young Christian. I knew that this day was central to what Christians believed, but I hadn't quite wrapped my mind around it, much less figured out how to talk about it to my non-Christian friends. So I dove into Christian apologetics, a classic book on the topic, Evidence That Demands a Verdict by Josh McDowell. It's been revised and reprinted countless times over the years, and it continues to help followers of Jesus understand the reasons for their faith, especially why we should believe in the resurrection. My wrestling with the resurrection continued, unabated, into adulthood. When I went to graduate school to study the New Testament, I even considered writing a dissertation on the resurrection. I had a great idea. I would compare the New Testament stories of Jesus' resurrection to pagan parallels of philosophers and holy men who supposedly appeared to people after their death. It really was a great idea. So great that I eventually found out that several others had already researched and written on the topic with much the same conclusions that I hoped to reach. So it didn't pan out as a dissertation topic, but the resurrection remains a keen interest of mine. What exactly is the resurrection all about? I would say the resurrection was the seed from which the Christian faith grew. It was the generative event. I'm convinced that without the resurrection, there would be no Christianity. Jesus would just be a first-century Jewish reformer of interest to historians of religion, but few others. There would be no Christian church, no worldwide movement of his followers. We wouldn't reflect on the death of Jesus if it hadn't been followed by his resurrection. Jesus would just be another troublemaker whom the Romans crucified, like so many others. If God hadn't raised Jesus from the dead, Spartacus would be more famous. At least Spartacus had an army. So I want to talk with you about the resurrection this morning. Let's wrestle with it together. Perhaps the most important passage in the New Testament about the resurrection, apart from the gospel stories of the event itself, is Paul's reflection on it in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. I'm secretly glad that the Corinthians were confused about the resurrection because Paul had to straighten them out, and as a result, we have 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Now, for the reading of 1 Corinthians 15, verses 51 to 57, I have chosen the King James Version. Now, you might wonder, why do you want to use a translation that's over 400 years old, sounds funny, and isn't based on the best biblical scholarship? It's okay. I know what I'm doing. I am a professional. Do not try this at home. The fact is that the King James Version of this particular passage has some rhetorical qualities that other versions lack. So with a few minor tweaks, here's the King James Version of 1 Corinthians 15, 51 to 57. Behold, I show you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet. For the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. For this corruptible must put on incorruption, and this mortal must put on immortality. So when this corruptible has put on incorruption, and this mortal has put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your sting? O grave, where is your victory? The sting of death is sin, and the strength of sin is the law. But thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. The Corinthian Christians were messed up. These folks probably would have won the prize for the most dysfunctional Pauline church. Confusion about the fact, the nature, and the significance of the resurrection was just one of many problems that the Corinthians had. But it was arguably the most serious problem since it went to the heart of their faith. Now, by most accounts, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 falls into three parts, each one with its own contribution to Paul's argument. In verses 1 to 11, the first part, Paul discusses the basis for the resurrection faith. The foundation of the gospel message consists of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and the latter, the resurrection, is assured by the various appearances of the risen Christ that are enumerated by Paul. There were witnesses to this event. First individuals, then dozens of folks, then hundreds of witnesses in different settings at different times. This is very important because the resurrection cannot be written off as Peter's delusion brought on by the trauma of the crucifixion and maybe a little bit too much Passover wine. Paul says, this is what I preach, this is what others preach, this is what we all believe. This is the common foundation of the Christian faith. God raised Jesus from the dead. A friend of mine in graduate school wrote a book in which he urged that the resurrection is wrongly understood if taken historically. Rather, he insisted the resurrection is to be understood experientially. Well, Paul and most Christians, myself included, would strongly disagree. The resurrection is not fully appreciated unless it is understood both as a historical event and an experience in daily living. God raised Jesus from the dead, and that is the basis of our faith. In the second section of 1 Corinthians 15, verses 12 to 34, Paul addresses the hope of our future resurrection. The Corinthians were confused about this too. The problem seems to be that some at Corinth denied the general resurrection or perhaps thought that it had already happened. Paul insists that Jesus' resurrection is the first fruits of the general resurrection. Now, first fruits is not a word that we use a whole lot nowadays. But it simply means that when the first produce of a crop appears, you know that a full-blown harvest is coming. Jesus' resurrection is the first fruits of the coming general resurrection. How can you deny, as the Corinthians did, that the harvest is coming when the first fruits have already appeared? And let's not think, as some of the Corinthians may have thought, that the resurrection is a vague spiritual idea. Maybe the resurrection happened when we weren't looking. They may have thought that, when we say Jesus rose from the dead, what we're really saying is flowers bloom again in the spring, or it will all turn out well in the end, or someday COVID will be over. No. If your life was a computer, the resurrection is not just antivirus software to fix a minor glitch. The resurrection is new hardware, a completely new operating system, a total reboot. The third and final section, 1 Corinthians 15, verses 35 to 58, Paul explains the nature of the resurrection body. Paul introduces a hypothetical question. He likes to do this sometimes, just put words in someone else's mouth hypothetically. So he says, someone will ask, but how are the dead raised? With what kind of body do they come? Then Paul shoots back at this hypothetical questioner. Fool! Not one of Paul's more pastoral moments. Paul goes on to explain that our present mortal bodies are not to be confused with the resurrection body, which is immortal, incorruptible. In the age to come, our bodies will be transformed. All the weaknesses and frailties of our personal body, these sacks of protoplasm that we walk around in, all of those will be swallowed up by immortality. Let's do a quick survey. Show of hands. How many of you have ever had an illness of any kind or an injury of any kind? Okay, if Superman were here today, his hand probably wouldn't be up, but most of us mortals had a hand up on that one. And if you couldn't raise a hand on that, at some point in your life, you will be able to. In your resurrection body, though, you'll not have to worry about those things. Injuries, illness, weaknesses, frailties, they'll all be things of the past. The resurrection body will make Superman look like a wuss. But that future hope is based on historical fact. God raised Jesus from the dead so we can experience a new spiritual life now and also a resurrected body in the future. When Paul gets to verse 50 in 1 Corinthians 15, he begins summing up. The resurrection of the dead, already foreshadowed in Christ, will be the crescendo of God's great symphony of redemption. I will show you a mystery, he says. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. Just as an aside, that's a good verse to put on the door of your church's nursery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed. By verse 54, Paul is no longer arguing the case. He's just celebrating. Death will be finally conquered. The grave will be vanquished. God gives us this victory through Jesus Christ. For in Christ's resurrection, we have the guarantee of the full and final conquest of death. Some years ago, I was in a Sunday school class shortly before Easter, and the teacher asked us, how would you communicate the cross and the resurrection of Jesus to someone with no background in the church whatsoever? Well, that was a provocative question, and different members of our class took a stab at it, trying to sum up the cross and the resurrection with a metaphor, an image, a memorable phrase. I had to ponder this one for a while myself. I thought, well, the crucifixion and the resurrection were a dramatic contest. Jesus fighting against the ultimate foe, death. But how can we sum up this most climactic of events? What analogy is there for the shock of Jesus' death and then the thrill of his resurrection? And how can we make that intelligible to the secular world? Well, it wasn't long before the answer occurred to me. It was so natural. It was so obvious. Professional wrestling. So I set about to visualize the spectacle of the cross and the resurrection in an imaginative way. I need you to give me a little bit of slack here. Just go with me for a while. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Jerusalem's Golgotha Amphitheater, the Palace of Malice. Get ready for an all-out, to-the-finish, ultimate grudge match. Jesus Christ versus death and the grave. It will all happen right here today, so let's get ready to rumble. I'm your ringside host, Paul of Tarsus, and with me today is Tom Didymus. Tom, can you fill us in on the contestants for today? Well, Paul, death is a fearsome opponent. He's had a long career, but shows no sign of weakening, and he is technically undefeated. There were some questionable matches of a year or two ago. You may remember Lazarus and a few others. They appeared to beat death, but the judges later ruled that they had received unauthorized assistance, and so they were disqualified. Moreover, death promised that he would come back in a rematch and defeat Lazarus and the others. So as I said, death is technically undefeated. But death is only half of the most fearsome tag team ever assembled. His partner today is the grave. The grave is a ruthless monster who has swallowed up every opponent he's ever met in the ring. Years ago, he used to wrestle under the name Sheol, but since becoming a major international attraction, he has been the grave. That's an impressive duo, Tom. Now, tell us about the challenger who will be taking on these two, and how did anyone ever get matched up solo against a tag team like Death and the Grave? Well, that's an interesting story, Paul. For a few years now, Jesus has had a large school of associates, any one of whom might have served as his tag team partner. Most prominent among them was a bruiser named Simon Peter, a.k.a. The Rock. Only a few days ago, Peter was loudly promising to accompany Jesus all the way to this final showdown. But according to reports within the last 24 hours, The Rock is now denying that there was ever an agreement between them. He even disputes that he was Jesus' sparring partner. This strange turn of events has led to what you see today. Jesus will face down death in the grave all alone. It seems like a bizarre mismatch, Tom. I mean, check out the epithet for Jesus, the meek and lowly. Hardly sounds like the name of a professional wrestler. We don't have any stats on Jesus, but he looks like he's about 5'7", maybe 150 pounds. He seems badly mismatched going up against death, who is 6'8", 385 pounds of muscle, and the grave, who is even larger. Where did this Jesus come from, Tom? Well, Paul, he's had a rather short career. He got his start in the amateur leagues up north in Galilee. He did have a few impressive early wins. You may remember Demoniac Dan and Spiro the Unclean Spirit, and that tag team from a few years back, Infirmity and Disease. But that was minor action compared to what the little prophet is up against today. This could be brutal. Well, there's the bell for the start of round one. Death and the grave are wasting no time at all. They're headed across the ring for Jesus. Oh, this is horrible. Death has Jesus in that dreaded hold, the crucifix. I don't remember anyone ever escaping from this hold. While death has him pinned from behind, the grave is moving in mercilessly. You can see him do his dirty work, the traditional blows to the feet, the hands, the head, and finishing him off with a sharp jab to the side. Just minutes into this contest, and Jesus has collapsed in the center of the ring. Confusion reigns, ladies and gentlemen. No one seems to know what has happened. They've called for medical staff. They're now in the ring. Oh my goodness, ringside doctors have confirmed it, ladies and gentlemen. Jesus has died. This is a horrible turn of events. We're waiting now for the ambulance personnel to come and remove the body. This is the worst disaster I've ever witnessed in professional wrestling. And to make matters worse, death and the grave seem to be unfazed. They aren't showing a smidgen of remorse. Rather, they're strutting around the ring and taunting the crowd. The paramedics are arriving now. Ladies and gentlemen, in a few moments, they'll be removing the body of Jesus. But wait a minute. Where is the body of Jesus? The pitiful, crumpled frame of the little prophet was in the center of the ring moments ago, and now it's nowhere to be found. Right you are, Paul. Confusion reigns in the arena. The body of Jesus has completely disappeared. Apparently, someone has taken away the Lord, and we do not know where they have laid him. Wait just a minute. This is unbelievable. The little prophet whom ringside doctors pronounced dead moments ago is entering the ring again. Where did he go? Where did he come from? This is incredible. I can't believe my eyes. Am I hallucinating, Paul? No, Tom, you aren't hallucinating. And if you can't believe it, then maybe you should work your way down to ringside and see if you can touch his hands inside, Tom. Jesus is on his feet, and he's challenging the big brutes from across the ring. Well, death is outraged. He's charging at Jesus, who is backed into the corner. This is going to be brutal. Oh, death has rammed the corner with pile driver force. But at the last moment, Jesus disappeared. There he is in the opposite corner of the ring. Death just plowed full speed into an empty corner. He's reeling, ladies and gentlemen. Death may have knocked himself out. He's staggering. He's turning back this way. Oh, look at that. Death has a dent in his forehead the size of a turnbuckle. No, I take that back. That is the turnbuckle. Death has embedded the turnbuckle into his head, and he is in a daze. He's going down. There he goes, flat on his back. Well, the grave won't tolerate this. Like us, he can't figure out how Jesus came back, but he's determined now to finish the job. The grave is moving to the corner. He's climbing the ropes. He's at the top of the corner post now, turning back to face the ring. I'm afraid it's the dreaded free fall maneuver. The grave is going to launch himself into the air over Jesus, who is standing in the center of the ring. There he goes. The massive frame of the grave is vaulted over 12 feet above the ring, and now he's crashing down atop the little Messiah. Is there any hope of salvation? Wait! He's done it again! Ladies and gentlemen, a moment ago, Jesus had disappeared beneath the looming shadow of the grave, but he's now standing in a neutral corner. And the grave, well, he just slammed face first into the floor of the ring, leaving a gaping hole the size of a grave. The crowd here is on their feet. They are absolutely jubilant. They are chanting, "Death, where is your sting? Grave, where is your victory?" Ladies and gentlemen, this is extraordinary. This is the biggest comeback I've ever seen. Jesus, the little prophet from Nazareth, has achieved the first ever smackdown of death. He's the new world champion, the leader of the true new world order. And I have a feeling that he's going to remain undefeated for a long, long time. And it all happened right here in Jerusalem on Easter Sunday. Go in the victory of God.